action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, advertising and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chin-wag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today I've caught Andrew Willshire, an independent analytics consultant with a PhD in engineering. Andrew is the founder of Diametrical, a strategic consultancy that focuses on the space between people and data to unlock the real value of analytics. He has over a decade of experience in media analytics, and his expertise includes marketing mix modeling, media optimization, segmentation, and market analysis. And somehow he still finds time to talk politics for outlets such as The Spectator and Reaction Life, crunch numbers for JP Caslin's manifesto, and play funky music on the bass. Andrew says, finding clear insights based on analysis and understanding of consumer behaviour, developing a plan, implementing it, evaluating it against predicted results, and repeating the process isn't rocket science. Some might even call it marketing. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Hi there, Giles. Nice to be here.
Right, quick fire questions then, Andrew. So, Mac or PC?
Well, PC, every time.
Numbers or words?
Let's say numbers.
London or Strathclyde?
Oh, Strathclyde University, obviously.
Long or short of it?
Short.
Ritson or Sharp?
Sharp.
Right, two more. Stuart Hogg or Gavin Hastings?
Oh, as of Saturday, Stuart Hogg.
And quite ridiculously, Bootsy Collins or Colin Powell?
I have great respect for Colin Powell, but Bootsy's the man.
Nice. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Lovely to be here.
Let's get cracking. So I always ask people how they ended up doing what they're doing, and I'm particularly interested in that very first step. So can you tell our listeners about your first ever job or jobs and your first ever proper career job?
The very first thing I ever did was I inherited my brother's egg delivery business, I say in inverted commas, when I suppose I was like 14 or 15. I was just delivering some eggs in the neighbourhood.
How come you inherited it? He was an older brother, presumably.
Yeah. John is 2 years older. I think I can't remember. I think he might have gone to university, or he might have got just a better job. Yeah, that was probably the first thing I ever got paid for. I've done all kinds of things, really. Fast forward a little bit. I did a degree in electrical engineering and graduated in 2000. And then, following a very brief diversion through the Royal Navy, I returned to Strathclyde to do my PhD in fibre optic sensors for jet engine monitoring. Following that, I did a 1-year enterprise fellowship with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So that was looking at commercialisation of research. I did another year postdoc after that, and then I was kind of fed up with university life. And I moved to London, partly because Amy, who's now my wife, lived down there, and partly because I kind of wanted a change. And I ended up going to music college for a year, which, try telling your parents that you're off to music college having already spent the last 8 years at university. And then after that, so I needed a job. I figured that I was more likely to starve than to make it as a fully professional musician. And at that point, my brother was, I think, head of innovation at PhD. And he put me in contact with Sam Diaz, who was running brand science in the UK there, which was Omnicom's econometrics division. So that's how I ended up in this wonderful world of media.
The reason we asked that question, and you probably know already, is just that we particularly like to celebrate the non-linear journeys that people take. So yours starts with egg delivery, with a detour in the Royal Navy, jet engine monitoring. I'm not even sure I understand what that is, if I'm being honest. London Music College, Omnicom.
So I spent 2 years at brand science, sort of doing econometrics, just marketing mix modelling and that sort of thing. And then I moved to Data to Decisions, which was an independent at that point. It was run by Paul Dyson and Carl Weaver, and that was a really terrific job actually. And I sort of moved into doing more programming, so I kind of taught myself a bit more programming. I ended up building the sort of econometric modelling software and the optimisation software and some other bits and pieces that all of the analysts there used. And D2D was acquired by Dentsu. So I did another couple of years there, sort of working on some innovation stuff. I moved to Posterscope for a short period of time, then went to a small company specialising in agent-based modelling called Sandtable, which was acquired by WPP a little while ago. I was just there for a year, and then I went to Maxis as Global Director of Advanced Analytics, which is a tremendous job title. The job title was sort of so much bigger than the job itself, but it's tremendous. And then just as Maxis was about to be smashed together with MEC to form Wavemaker, they were making redundancies, so I took redundancy, and I've been on my own ever since. And here we are, 4 years later.
4 years later. And how long roughly was that journey you've just shared? Because there were quite a few stops.
From graduating to now is 21 years. So I graduated in 2000.
Fantastic. So you say you've been on your own, you're on your own now. You've also been, as I understand it, with JP quite a bit.
It's kind of a Twitter conversation that got out of hand, I suppose.
Don't they all?
Actually, too many of my Twitter conversations, they tend to get out of hand one way or another. I was looking back because I thought it might come up as like, how did we first get in contact? And there's definitely some stuff. I'd written a couple of things for Marketing Week, which he had commented on, and had the temerity to disagree with, and even quoted the long and the short of it at me as justification. And then just it's one of these Twitter things. I've met so many like really great people on Twitter, and the ones that can put up with me constantly arguing that black is white, will sort of hang around. So I've got a little sort of group of people that tolerate me, and we just get into these conversations. And then when JP said he was writing something about the long and the short of it, and that sort of kind of stuff more widely, then I think I'd already had a couple of arguments with various people online, and he sort of asked if I wanted to sort of co-write this bit with him, with me approaching it from the more sort of data side. Just a little collaboration, really. But
okay.
Yeah, no, I really like JP, because he's always up for an argument. The only things we've ever seriously disagreed on are putting mint sauce on lamb, which he says is an abomination. And
he's wrong, we both know that.
Yeah. And he also thinks that we had an argument where he said that data in English is a plural word, whereas all sensible people that know it's a singular mass noun. So you say the data is telling us this, not the data are telling us this. There's nothing sets my teeth on edge as much as people saying the data are. But there we go.
Oh, that's good to know. That's good to know. I'm pleased you've clarified that somewhat. And JP is a good friend, and not least a friend of the pod, as you well know. So on his recent episode, we talked a bit about the effectiveness elephant in the room. So you found that elephant together, as I understand it. How did you approach the project? How did you approach it in a way that complemented what JP was doing? It would be useful to know in kind of layman's terms, if you just pretend I'm a total moron, which is alarmingly easy to do.
Well, like I say, I wasn't really approaching it fresh, because I'd sort of engaged with it a little bit online to different degrees. And it's one of these things that kind of starts with, I sort of have some instinctive reservations about it, about the general principle, and sort of express that, and then people will sort of argue, and then you sort of express it more expansivly, perhaps. And so, in a sense, I had some of the material already done, because I'd written in some emails to JP and Weimer as well, just explaining sort of why I thought that it possibly wasn't as reliable a rule as it might be. The sort of 60-40 rule. The number one reservation is that it's clearly a partial data set. You have the number of media campaigns that are analysed and submitted for an IPA award is a very small minority, and it's biased towards campaigns that at least somebody thinks has done well. Whether or not it has, it's at least believed to have done well. And it's in the interests of the agency and the client and anybody else associated with it to emphasize just how well it's done. Just because everybody likes an award, because you get an award and you get promotion and you get to move on in your career and so the rest of it. Whereas there are precious little incentives for being entirely objective about the performance of something that you've worked on.
Yeah, people rarely enter awards to take part.
That's sort of why should be. There's a lot of work to do, but at the same time, they're not impartial observers of their own work. In a data set like this, you cannot replace missing data. I mean, it's biased towards sort of effective. It's also biased towards interesting. People like a story to tell. And if you're just to sort of draw your quadrant diagram of interesting versus boring and effective and non-effective, then you've only really got samples from the interesting and effective corner. The boring and effective corner, your standard sort of an FMCG TV campaign which came up with a tolerably good ROI, for example. Not really award-winning material. There's no great story. It's just this is competent. Things that are interesting that absolutely bombed. There's a few of them out there. If you spend enough time doing econometric modelling, then the really interesting stuff, somebody at an agency is desperate for you to find a big effect for, and there's nowhere to be found, and you have to break it to them that whatever their hot idea was seemed to have absolutely no impact on the general public. And then there's the boring and ineffective, which I suspect is an awful lot of advertising. And so because you've only populated one corner of this diagram in a sense, and you cannot make the inference about what the data in the other quadrants would tell you. So at a very simple level, you could say, okay, the 60-40 rule, we'll spend 60% on brand building and 40% on activation. For all you know, every single, the average in every single one of these quadrants is also 60-40. It might just be that is how people plan media, sort of bit of both. Is it actually responsible for the outsized performance, or in something as complicated as marketing? It could be any one of a number of factors. That's kind of my biggest sort of bugbear with it, is that you're making quite a strong, specific claim on data that is incomplete.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And on a wider scale, I've heard you describe the state of data and analytics, just generally speaking, in media as appalling. So let's take long and short of it away for now, and just think about the generic use of data and analytics. What makes you think that it is so bad?
I'll put a small disclaimer on and say it's not universally wrong. There are some really competent people in pockets, shall we say. However, in fact, I'll make a special mention for Alex Steer, who's at Wunderman Thompson as their chief data officer, who's not from a data background originally. I think he's got an MPhil from either Oxford or Cambridge in medieval literature, but he's got as good a feel for analytics and data as probably anybody in the business. So I'll give Alex a shout out. But in so many other areas, it's almost non-existent, and I think that there's no other industry takes so little care in tracking its inputs and outputs. For example, if you were a client and you phoned up an agency and said, well, I want to know how much I spent on press advertising last year and I'd like a weekly breakdown, you'll probably find that the most junior member in the team is going to spend 3 days digging through plans, trying to work out what was agreed, what was implemented, what was actually spent, what was delivered, and they still won't be entirely sure. It just disappears into a black hole, and it's certainly very rare for it then to be joined up with any sort of robust performance analysis, or tracked internally to see, what was delivered against what we promised the client. How's our performance in that area doing? So that's sort of one example. I mean, another example, just the other day, I asked a small agency for I needed some Facebook data, impressions data by week. And that arrived in Microsoft Word with somebody had, I mean, not sort of questioning their willingness to help or anything like that, but they sort of would copy, they would run a report for a week, then cut and paste off the web page into a Word document, and then go on to the next page and do it again. And it took them hours to say, okay, here's like a few weeks of Facebook impression data. And it still staggers me that that's not a sort of uncommon thing to see in the media industry.
There's likely so many variables which have contributed to, I think, so much ambiguity in our industry. Certainly, 2 points I'd like to make. One, that whenever I've spoken to Weimer in the past, he seems to regularly remind me that people need to interrogate the data more, asking if we can really tell something from the data. The second point I was going to make, when you've got the duopoly of Facebook and Google, A, marking their own homework, and B, not even agreeing on the definitions of some of the terms that they kind of spew back at marketers. It is so ambiguous. I mentioned to JP that I think semantics are often the root of so many problems in marketing, but presumably that can't help the situation.
No, I think certainly on the digital platforms, you would think that it would be a lot easier than it seems to be to get accurate data in a format that is very usable. And I don't know to what extent some of these problems are people haven't been trained to use the platform effectively, or are sort of unfamiliar with data practices, so that they don't really know what they should be expected to do in that sort of sense. I think it's that. But I think just in the old-fashioned, above-the-line media, as it was, TV, press, outdoor, there's just I don't know if it's a lack of desire or a lack of interest in being rigorous about collecting data on these things. It's rare for it to be a sort of really rigorous practice in an agency to have your data. The thing that we buy and sell on to clients, to have that in a really neat form that it should be. I mean, if you were the CEO of Volkswagen and you sort of say, I want to know how many cars that factory produced last Tuesday that were blue, you could probably find that out. If you knew the right person, you could probably find that out in like 10 minutes. Whereas finding out simple facts about your media purchase schedule, like I say, it could take days for people to figure out what was actually done.
And is that a problem, presumably, that would exist with businesses which have a significant media spend?
Well, we're talking at all scales, really. I mean, some of the really big advertisers, Coca-Cola's, Diageo's, are certainly putting more pressure on agencies to be better, and definitely asking for data to be submitted in a more precise form. And you sort of see the friction there when it becomes a lot of work to fulfill the requirements that the client is asking for. But actually, what the client is asking for should be easy to produce. It should be, yes, we know what we bought, we know what we did, we know what we planned. We don't have to go digging about in emails to know what we intended to do and whether that was done or not.
Is there any way you can defend marketers for that situation? I think the lack of understanding of the media is obviously a key issue. I'm not trying to defend that. But what about when it comes to actually understanding what is being purchased? And again, I'm probably thinking more on across digital advertising, but there is so much murkiness and fraudulent activity and a huge lack of transparency in what is being purchased often.
Yes, no, I'd completely agree with that. So I think Facebook is probably the most egregious offender in many ways in terms of metrics. The number of times they've had to reevaluate their metrics and say, oh, actually, we've massively overstated this. If you say, I want to reach this many millennials in the USA, then they'll tell you they can reach twice as many millennials as actually exist in the USA. That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think they famously did that in Sweden, didn't they, a few years ago? I remember reading something about that, yeah.
At what point does carelessness sort of turn into almost fraud? It's almost offensive to someone that cares about data. It just feels offensive. And then you've got things like, oh yes, this metric says that counts every time that one pixel was shown for 1 second on a screen. It's like, well, how could that possibly affect what a consumer does? What one pixel? And you might say, well, we think that it's roughly proportional. That we have a fairly uniform distribution, and that 80% of adverts that fall under this metric were actually seen in full on screen for 3 seconds or more. But they don't seem very forward in proving that, if you know what I mean. And if they were forward in proving, you just say, well, why don't you just tell me what percentage of my adverts were seen in full on screen for 3 seconds? And that seems like it's a much more reasonable metric. And the answer is that most of them are just scrolled past.
Going back one step, then I think the whole we can reach more people than really exist. I understand that one of the comments they made in defense of that was the way they treated devices as if each device was a unique person and not just another device owned by the same person. For example, you might have a smartphone and a laptop, and they'd count that as two people, not one person with two devices. So, I mean, that in itself is clearly going to lead to all sorts of problems when it comes to then understanding the value of what you're doing and trying to hit your objectives. The other one, with your point about one pixel being visible for more than 1 second, I think for a time, Facebook classed an impression as above 0 pixels for above 0 seconds. So actually, it was probably even worse than that. And then, of course, that ultimately just leads to an even bigger problem with attribution, which is already an issue in itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's very few things that point to a utter lack of robustness, and also a lack of interest in being robust, than the way that attribution came to sort of dominate the digital field for most of the last decade. And I think it's now becoming less relevant because sort of the individual level data is becoming unavailable. But the no one could ever have pointed to attribution modeling and said, here we go, this is robust and defensible. There's so many issues with it, and it should have been obvious to the people. It might have been obvious to the people selling it. It should certainly have been obvious to the people buying it, people in agencies. Just taking massive credit for purchases that actually they had nothing to do with. Again, there's sort of a lot of misaligned incentives here. For example, doing simple last click attribution. There's all kinds of reasons why it's wrong, but it's actually very easy to understand. It's very easy to optimize your plan based on it, and you can tell the client that you're optimizing based on attribution. And whether it actually works or not is sort of secondary to being able to say that you're doing it. And that actually is a sort of a general problem with data as a practice in advertising, is that there's an awful lot of interest from people like saying they're doing it rather than sort of actually doing it well.
When I spoke to JP recently, we talked a lot about context and obviously a lot about complexity. Is that a reason why people typically misread or misunderstand and misuse data?
It is complex, but there's also there are things that you can do right that are simple as well. And sort of the stuff around actually just tracking well what you're buying and selling is one element of that. Yeah, I think the interest, actually being interested in doing it, and so here's kind of the sort of key point, is that data doesn't it doesn't just fall from the sky. It's not a thing in itself. It's an artifact that's produced as one of the sort of spurious outputs of an underlying system, or what a statistician might refer to as the data generating process. So there's something happening in real life, and one way or another, somebody's taking some measurements at certain parts of this, and these turn up on a spreadsheet. And what the objective should be is to say, we want to understand this underlying process, and we are going to try and use the various bits of data that are produced to help us understand that process. And once you start down that line, actually wanting to understand what is going on, and that the data is a means to that end, and you're trying to understand how what you do affects that underlying process, then you start to have a framework which you can work in to say, this is what this is what we're trying to do. We actually have a purpose to doing this. Whereas in a lot of agencies, you still have, well, we get data in, and then there are certain standard reports that we run, and then we turn them into 150 slide presentations, and then we present that to the client, and then we all stare at each other across the table, and then say, great, let's do this again next month. And too often, no one actually says, well, hang on, what are the numbers actually indicating? Are they indicating something? Are they just random noise? Do they indicate that the underlying process is changing, so that something that previously worked is no longer working? Is that the case? Can we validate that with something else? You often get the case where you have sort of two pieces of data which are telling you contradictory things, for example. But if you analyze, or if you think about where that came from, these were both outputs from the same process. Trying to understand why they're different, and saying, well, okay, is it the way that we measured them? Is it different? Is it to do with exactly what we measured? Was it the time? Is one of them just too small a sample size? Is one of them we actually asked a different set of people? And if you find that you asked two sets of people the same question and you get different answers, then there you go. That's something that's interesting. That is something that's been revealed to you about the underlying process. Whereas if you just look at two bits of data and say, well, these are contradictory, so we'll just ignore them both and we'll do whatever we plan to do anyway, then it feels like, well, what's the point? And I think so many of the activities around the use of data in media, you could just say, well, what's the point?
Yeah, I think data in itself is no substitute for critical thinking, is it? And often it's seen as a way of avoiding critical thinking. And your slide deck presentation was a good example of that.
I was kind of trying to think of an analogy for this, and I sort of like, if you had a group of musicians that like were in some sort of ensemble, and then the conductor says one day, right, we're going to be a guitar-led band. Does anybody play guitar? No one does, but somebody says, well, I own a guitar. So, right, well, that'll do for now. And, they sort of stand up on the guitar. It doesn't actually change anything about how the band sounds. They're just standing there holding a guitar. And then somebody else turns up and says, I also own a guitar. And it says, oh, well, but that guitar looks different, or it sounds different, or it's just different. Why are these two guitars different? If you had actually somebody that could play guitar, might tell you, oh, they're for different purposes. They do different things at different times, and some are appropriate in some contexts and some aren't. But instead, you just say, oh, we'll just put both guitars on stage, and just carry on as we are. And eventually you end up with like 30 people holding guitar, but still no guitarist. And I think, some agencies are a bit like that, where they will show you all of the data that they've got, but much of it doesn't make a blind bit of difference to how the agency actually functions, how the plans are output, how they work with a client, how they think about what they're doing. And I think that's sort of a great shame. I mean, not, as I say, not all agencies, not all people, but in the main, I think, especially among a lot of senior leadership, there's just a complete bewilderment about what their expected to do with data.
The only musical analogy I can force into yours there is well, I've heard it's something similar. I've heard how people use data, or the dreaded averages or dreaded best practice, and it's someone trying to write a hit song, and they say, what's the most commonly played key in all of the best top songs ever released? Let's start with that one.
Well, apparently Alex Kapranos was a bit of Franz Ferdinand was kind of quite into that.
Oh, really?
He would know what tempos hit songs tended to be in.
That's interesting. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, Andrew, because I am familiar with your piece in Marketing Week, is you're thinking that long-term effects of advertising are overemphasized. What makes you think that?
I think I've never had a really good answer to the question, sort of like, well, how can it be a bad thing to sell your product tomorrow to someone? Because a lot of time it's like, oh, we'll build the brand and we'll hope that people will at some point buy. Well, there are people buying tomorrow, provided you're not slashing the price and sort of forcing it into their hand and making a loss on it. It doesn't seem to me that there's any difference in selling your product to these people tomorrow than say, oh, I'd rather they bought in 3 months' time. Your advertising is not a Christopher Nolan film. It's not something that 6 months from now somebody will wake up at 3 a.m. and say, "My God, I understand it." So I'm going to buy a Toyota tomorrow. It's like actually somebody is going shopping tomorrow to buy a car, and the best thing you can do is get them to go to the Toyota garage first. Just give them a little prompt, and hopefully they'll go there, because I think research shows that there's a disproportionate number of people will buy at the first place they go to. For example, to buy a car at the first garage they go to. There's something in there about the sort of satisficing that Rory Sutherland will talk about. It's like, oh yes, here it is. This is good enough. Let's get it over with. I don't want to spend all day going around garages. So it's sort of that very short-term effect. This kind of came from a project I did some years ago at D2D, where we were modelling for Honda in the USA. I think this was the first big car brand we'd ever done, and we kind of read around the research. It's like, oh yeah, we understand that we probably won't see a big obvious effect from advertising, like in the same week, because it's all the literature says a very long-term consideration and on all the rest of it. And we couldn't have been more wrong. There's a massive short-term effect from advertising in the car market. At any one time, there are a lot of people about to go and buy a car tomorrow. So, let's target them. It's kind of related as well. I think that brands are primarily built through product experience. It's like, I think brand love follows purchase. It doesn't lead purchase. So it's unusual for someone to say that they love a brand, but never to have purchased something. I guess something like a Ferrari, maybe. But then maybe you could argue that Ferrari is a brand designed to be experienced vicariously. But it's like if you're selling cough medicine or soup or something like that, then the best thing you can do is get somebody to buy some tomorrow and enjoy it and have it in their cupboard, or get them to buy again and again. And that all feels like it's, get them to buy in the short term. When you start digging into sort of long term, the effect of advertising as well, the estimates of how many adverts that an adult sees in a day, I think the lower bound is 500 and the upper bound is like 5,000 or something like that. Do they all have a long term effect? It feels like you'd be utterly paralyzed in your ability to make a decision if if your car purchase 6 months from now was being influenced by the 1,000 car adverts that you saw, as opposed to the one that you saw yesterday. I just think it seems much more likely that the shorter term effect, while you're about to pull the trigger on a purchase decision, is more likely to have the impact that you want. And it's not to say there isn't a long-term effect. I think there's a long-term effect, particularly through repeat purchase, particularly through, for example, if you buy a car, your first car, it's very likely to be the same brand as your parents bought. the next car you buy is disproportionately likely to be the same brand as the last car you had. All of these things, all of these constituent parts of what make up a brand, it's all about, ultimately, it's like getting a good product into people's hands. And, the endowment effect will say, oh yes, I actually, people like the car that they've bought more than they sort of liked it prior to purchase. It's that sort of idea that now that this is mine, I think it's fabulous. There's a really good experiment a few years ago where an economics professor gave sort of class mugs to half of his class and said, all right, try and sell your mug to someone in the class that doesn't have a mug. It was almost impossible for anyone to make a purchase because anybody that had a mug, the endowment effect made them think it was really much more valuable than anybody that didn't have a mug thought it was worth to buy it from them.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a great little example of saying, people love the thing they have, and it's partly sort of post justification of purchase, but it's also it's experience. People that really love Apple Macs, keep on buying them, and they probably love them because the first one they bought was great, and they become evangelists. And I think the impact of advertising on that long-term brand effect is far less than the fact that people like the product.
Yeah, but equally, people get locked into an ecosystem, don't they? I think that can sometimes conveniently be forgotten in that Mac or PC debate.
Well, I have a long-standing grudge against Apple because I bought an iPod dock. The first time I bought a really good hi-fi system, I bought an iPod dock for it. And then the next iPod I bought, it was the same shape of connector, but they changed the pin configuration for no good reason, which meant it didn't work. So I had £100 worth of dock. It staggers me that a company that can be so willfully abusive to their customer base again and again and again, changing connectors, all of them non-standard with anything else. People do love their Macs, except me.
I think going back to your point about long and short, I think the only real harm people can do focusing solely on the short is, as you caveated it at the beginning, if any sort of price promotion is to bring forward sales. But perhaps there's an argument to say it's limiting reach to focus on short term because you don't reach the entire market. You only reach those who are actually in a buying situation or more likely to be in a buying situation. But aside from that, it's a very good point.
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of definitional issues. It says, what is a brand advert? What is an activation advert? If I see your beautiful brand advert on the TV and I pop out the next day and buy something, have I got that wrong?
Is
have
it
I
therefore not a
misunderstood?
brand ad anymore? Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems these definition problems. I mean, no. Just as we were talking about definitions in digital space, just these sort of broad brush categories of saying, oh yes, this is brand, oh that's activation, but they're still going out at ITV at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that in the piece that you mentioned, I sort of referenced Erwin Efron, sort of who'd sort of like had this thing called recency theory, which is essentially that at any moment in time, there's always somebody that's about to buy in your category. There's always thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that are about to buy in your category, probably tomorrow or maybe even today. And if your advertising should affect their decision much, and you should worry about that much more than thinking about the purchase decision of somebody 3 months from now.
Cool, makes a lot of sense. Can I put a couple of listener questions to you, Andrew?
Yeah, of course.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but we do have two. Starting with Sam. Sam says, Andrew, you, like Giles, I know, support the idea of asking stupid questions. What's so important about asking them, and why are they so difficult to ask?
Well, one of my professors once said, if you have a question, you should always ask it because guaranteed there's like 20 other people in the room that also have the same question. And it's partly about most people are very bad at judging what other people know. Me as a lecturer or as a teacher, I can assume all sorts of knowledge because it might be very familiar to me, so I assume that lots of other people have it. I might assume that you'd read a book that you haven't. You might have, all of these kinds of reasons that you can have an assumed knowledge. And at some point, somebody has to say, actually, I don't have that knowledge. Can you just clarify that for me? And 9 times out of 10, the person will be like, oh yeah, sure, I should have said this is the answer. And I think certainly as you get a little bit older and more experienced, feeling able to ask these questions feels more like a sign of confidence than it does a sort of sign of ignorance or weakness. Having said that, I have sometimes asked questions and had such a withering put down about, you should have known that, that sort of 1 time in 10 it's not very pleasant, but I think it's worth it on balance.
Great answer. Number 2 is from Kerry, and we're going back to analytics now. So Kerry asks, what are some of the most common mistakes or assumptions people make when using basic tools such as Google Analytics? So we can probably expand that outside of Google Analytics too, just to be fair. But
the most common mistake is to focus on the sort of summary statistics of whatever factor it is you're looking at. What's much more interesting is to try and look at the distribution, the sort of the variation over time, because statistics is the art of losing information. You're trying to take something that's very complex and lots of data points, and then you're trying to say, I want one number that will represent this, which is fine because in many cases, you don't have the cognitive capacity necessarily or the time to work with all the data. But an awful lot of the time you do. So this kind of goes back to some of the sort of ideas around systems thinking, that there was a process, there's an underlying process which has generated this data. If you look at the full range of the data that was generated, how much of it is sort of very high value, how much is it a low value, how much clustering there is, does it cluster around the center, does it cluster in 2 or 3 separate points? All of these are factors that sort of should either help you understand or send you looking or realize you don't understand what's going on, and the effort to try and understand is what makes a sort of a better analyst, if you like. There's all kinds of I'm sort of very enthusiastic about sort of just systems thinking in general, like how do you think about what the actions you take, how do they influence the real world, and that's something that sort of too few people make any effort at all in media, like thinking, okay, if I do this, where will that show up in the data? Who will it affect? What's going to change? How much is it going to change by? How quickly will it change? All of these things should be part of a continuous learning loop where you say, okay, I think I understand this. I think if I do this, this will be the result. You do it, and then you say, was I right? And that's incredibly rare to actually go back and check on your predictions. And it's even more rare for people to actually dig into the reasons why they were wrong. And that happens a lot. There's lots of campaigns that flop. We're very good in advertising and media about celebrating our successes, but failures are buried. And sometimes careers are buried along with them. But it's very rare if you have a total turkey of a campaign, that people will say, well, hang on, this came out of exactly the same process, the internal agency process that resulted in a previous really good campaign. We haven't really done anything different. So somewhere along the lines, we have made an assumption that has proven to be wrong. Let's go looking for that. Let's understand why we were wrong. Let's understand why this failed. and then we've got a better chance of not failing in future. And instead, what will tend to happen is that it'll be like, we'll just not mention it to the, we'll never mention it again. We'll think of some cockeyed reason why it was why that didn't work as we expected, but lessons learned are quite rare.
Yeah, the only it's quite a primitive example actually by comparison, but the only Google Analytics example I've got, because of the lack of context, you end up with lots of false binaries, as you do in all parts of our industry, admittedly. But I remember years and years ago talking to a client about their relatively new website that they had launched pre-engaging with us, and they were trying to understand their Google Analytics, and they had always been taught that a bounce rate was a bad thing and you didn't want the bounce rate to be high. But what if someone's search query has matched precisely to the page on your website that holds that information, so they find out the information they need from you and then leave the site? Surely that is a success for the customer. But I think it's too easy to almost, I suppose there's a cognitive argument to try and keep things easy and understand that a bounce rate is good or bad, when actually it's not. It's just a bounce, and it's the context that really reveals what's happening.
Yeah, and so that you have an underlying behavior. You have systemic behavior, and you could get around that by saying, well, I want my bounce rate to only be people that leave within 2 seconds. People that stay for 5 minutes and then leave, I don't want them counted in this bounce rate, for example. And that's kind of this is kind of what I mean about the distribution within that. So if you said, okay, show me the distribution of times that people spend on my page, and you plot it on a chart with sort of time along the x-axis, and you might have like a number of spikes. You might have a spike of people that realize in the wrong place within 2 seconds, and then there's a big gap, and then there's another spike up at around or maybe a bigger blob from between 60 seconds and 5 minutes. And you say, okay, so from the distribution, we can see these are the people that bounced immediately, and these are the people that spent some time consuming content. And what you would actually get, if you took the average, you would get a point that was neither of those things. It would be, it'd be about 20 seconds. You say, the average time that people spend on my page is 20 seconds. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, even though nobody did spend 20 seconds.
Exactly that. So that's what I mean about working with distributions to understand the underlying system.
Yeah, that's a really good way of understanding it. Actually, it reminds me of, I'm not sure if it's a Sutherland or a Trott story, but it could probably be either, where I think fighter plane cockpits were designed to fit the exact average of all of the, I think it was American fighter pilots, based on their body shape and limb length, etc. And what they found was it was uncomfortable for every single fighter because there wasn't one of them that actually matched those dimensions.
And there was a book published recently. I forget the name of it, but it was looking at how so many things are designed around male physiology and not female physiology. That women are definitely getting the raw deal on that, and that includes, I think, even like helicopters. to continue your analogy, is that it tends to be the reach is too great for sort of female pilots. But everything from like crash test dummies to seat belts to the symptoms of a heart attack are actually quite distinctly different between men and women. And this lack of understanding of the difference makes women more likely to die from a sort of undiagnosed heart attack.
The book could be one of Invisible Women Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, or Mismatch.
I think it's the first one, yeah.
Yeah, so we spoke to an incredible lady called Trisha Wang, who's an ethnographer, and she actually used the example of the room she was sitting in when we had our recording session was set to an aircon default based on the male body, not the female body. It was actually 1 or 2 degrees off what it would be comfortable for her. But yeah, I thought that was a great example. But no, you're right, absolutely right. Cool. So the final part of the interview then is our 4 pertinent posers that we put to all of our guests. Starting with number 1, what advice would you give to your younger self?
I mean, there was some. I was at an event with Dave Trott, and somebody asked him that question, and he said, don't worry so much about what other people think of you. It's worse than that. They're not thinking of you. They're thinking about their own lives. They're not even considering what you're up to. And so I always quite like that. At the same time, there's been points looking back on my slightly random career when I think I probably should have cared slightly more what certain people thought. Yeah, no, I don't necessarily have good advice, but I would say, enjoy it as you go.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, though, to be honest. Number 2, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why? I hope I know what you're going to say, and if you don't, I might force you to say it a bit later.
Well, one of the things I would definitely get rid of is earnouts. I think the earnout model of acquiring businesses could have been specifically designed to ruin company cultures, and I've experienced that a little bit, and I think it produces bad results all round. So I'd like to ban that.
And also, you would like to ban ROI.
Oh yeah, so
I knew I'd hook you on that.
yes, no, you have. ROI is an absolutely stinking metric to make any sort of evaluation. There are a number of reasons why. One is the most useful model that there is in media planning is just the idea of diminishing returns. So you if you were to draw a diminishing returns curve, as you increase spend on media, for example, or impressions or reach or whatever it is, then your line of the impact that has sort of increases and then starts to sort of it behaves asymptotically. It gradually gets closer to being completely flat. So there's a maximum effect. If you then say, okay, well, what we're really interested in is the amount of money that we generate, then you would draw another similar curve that would track just beneath the diminishing returns curve on the way up, and then it would curve and then it would peak. And so there'd be an optimum point to say this is the point at which the incremental revenue from media minus the cost of the media is at its maximum. And so that's really what you should be looking at. But ROI, and people aren't really very good at thinking about division as a mathematical operation. But ROI would be a curve that starts off at close to infinity for close to zero spend and only ever decreases. So ROI will be decreasing all the way through the period at which your incremental revenue is still increasing. And so if you optimize on ROI, then you're almost certainly going to end up under investing, and you're going to leave a potential profit on the table, all because that you're choosing to use a metric which was never designed for marketing expenditure. Return on investment for a start. Marketing is not an investment. Sorry, people. It's operational expenditure, and it's absolutely vital to the operation of a business. You are creating customers. It's like demand engineering. There's a perfectly good reason to say, we need to spend money creating customers, and that's just how the business runs. I think the whole that marketing has disappeared down to over 20 or more years, where everyone desperately says, "Oh, it's an investment," even while the financial director is looking at his rules on accounting and saying, "Nope, it's definitely a cost." It hasn't left the industry in a notably better position than it was. So anyway, for all those reasons, yes, we should completely banish ROI. And this it's actually in 2004, Tim Ambler from the London Business School wrote a paper called "ROI is Dead, Now Bury It," where he explained all of the problems with using ROI, and people have known it's a terrible metric for all this time. So that's 17 years, and yet we still manage to have seemingly the only thing we've managed to educate our clients to do is to focus on ROI, and I think that's a damning indictment of our of the industry.
Yeah, I've not read that paper. I'm gonna look it
I
up
can send it
straight
to
away.
you.
Oh, please do. Yeah, please do. In fact, we'll add it to this listing so that our listeners can pick it
Sure.
up too. Fantastic. I won't force feed you any more answers. I'm just wary that I wanted to try and tear that one to shreds earlier, and I missed my opportunity. Number 3, then, Andrew. Any books that you would recommend to our listeners?
So the first one I would recommend is it's by Douglas W. Hubbard, and it's called How to Measure Anything. And it's just a really interesting read about how to approach measurement in any environment essentially, but particularly about business. And there's all kinds of there's lots of wisdom, and there's lots of sort of counterintuitive stuff in there, and I sort of really enjoy it. The second one I'd sort of recommend is it's a book called Management F-Laws by Russell Acuff. Russ Acuff was a systems theorist. There's actually a brilliant YouTube video. It's only about 12 minutes, and it's called "If Russ Acuff Gave a TED Talk," and it's worth 10 minutes of anyone's time to just get an understanding of basic systems thinking. But the Management F-Laws, it's a number of sort of pithy little statements with a little bit of explanation. For example, like number 21, the less managers understand their business, the more variables they require to explain it. And so, anyone that's ever looked at a dashboard that's got 150 KPIs on it, will sort of recognize this.
That TED talk, funnily enough, or sorry, if he had given a TED talk, was sent to me by Bruce, who I think you're also familiar with after the episode with JP, and I hadn't seen it, and it was absolutely incredible.
It is brilliant. Third book on my pile is called Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer, and that's by Duncan J. Watts. And this it should be sort of read by anybody working with data in a media context, because it sort of shines some light on the idea that we're very good at rationalizing why sort of if we get some data, we'll say, oh well, that makes perfect sense. But if you can say, oh, that makes perfect sense regardless of what the data says, you say, oh yeah, I can work that, I can see why that might be the case, then that's of absolutely no use in trying to predict beforehand what might happen. So I mean, the sort of classic example that he gives in the book is they did a survey of American GIs following the Second World War, and they said the sort of report was that people from a country background actually found it easier to adjust to life in the army. And they would ask people about that, and they would say, oh yeah, that makes sense because people from the country are used to getting up early, they're used to tiring physical work, all these kind of things. And then the researchers said, all right, well actually we found the exact opposite. There was people from the city that did better. And you can kind of say, oh yeah, well that makes sense because people are used to living in close quarters with each other. They're used to not getting on each other's nerves and that sort of thing. And because you can post-rationalize whatever this survey found, if you had to think in advance who is going to do better, you find that you don't have any good reason for thinking. Okay, my final recommendation, which I read last year, is The Mind is Flat by Nick Chater, who is, I think, a professor of behavioural science at Warwick. And that's all about sort of brain and cognition. And, it's one of the sort of few books I would say has genuinely changed how I perceive other people and myself.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Nice one. And then number 4, we always dedicate every episode to somebody, and we bestow that honour to our guest who has to give their reason why. So would you do the honours, Andrew?
Yes. I've got so many people, because I've made so many sort of good friends in sort of my time in media. But I'll just mention, I mentioned them earlier. I mentioned Paul Dyson and Carl Weaver earlier. and I think they probably had the biggest influence on sort of my career development, because they created an environment where I sort of was really able to develop some of my thinking and ideas. And if anyone's ever in any doubt about the sort of the role that managers can play in creating a work environment, then those guys are a perfect example of how to do that.
Cool. Well, this episode is very proudly dedicated to Paul and Carl then. So as a final call to action, everyone can head over to this episode. We'll share links to everything we've discussed, to all of the books, which were How to Measure Anything, Management F-Laws, Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer, The Mind is Flat. How else can people get more Andrew Willshire?
I've got a couple of articles up on Marketing Week from a couple of years ago, but I can normally be found arguing with someone or other on Twitter at AJ.
He's not lying, by the way.
At AJ Willshire. So yeah, I'm always happy to have an open and frank exchange of views, shall we say? And of course, I'm always available for hire.
Yes, of course. Well, we'll include both of those Marketing Week articles that you reference, and your Twitter handle. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful, mate. It's been great.
Well, thank you for the invite. Thank you for having me, and yeah, I've enjoyed this.
And finally, thank you to everybody listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share and review the pod. We really value your support. Keep questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online. You can check out CTA Pod on Instagram or email hello@calltoaction.co.
To action, I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. I can't get no call to action. Oh, I can't get no call to action. Yeah, hey, hey.